transmitted via streaming on the satellite channel of the Chamber of Deputies and will be broadcast on the web TV of the Chamber in both languages, Italian and English. Today's hearing will allow the remote participation of those heard and of deputies in accordance with regulation of November 4th, 2020. Today's hearing falls within the framework of the fact-finding missions on Italy's involvement in the international community for the promotion and protection of human rights and against discriminations. We will hear in video conference from representatives of the Survival International NGO in support of the rights of indigenous people in the Amazon. Also, on behalf of the members of our committee, I welcome and thank for their availability Ms. Francesca Casella, Director of Survival International Italy, who is connected remotely, as well as Ms. Fiona Watson, Director of Research and Advocacy. The topic of today's hearing is the severe emergency situation and danger in which many indigenous peoples of Brazil find themselves, and in particular, uncontacted peoples. Uncontacted peoples who inhabit areas over which formal processes of demarcation and protection have not yet been completed. I wish to reiterate that by uncontacted people, we mean tribal people who have no contact with any member of the dominant cultures and societies. These are not populations living in the Stone Age. They simply live differently and also have an unparalleled knowledge of their environment and of nature, of medicinal plants, which they use to cure diseases which are unknown to them. Contact with members of dominant societies is extremely dangerous for them, in some cases devastating. Some tribes have lost 90% of their population within a year or two of first contact. I wish to recall that Survival International was founded in 1969 by a group of people who learned of the genocide of Amazonian Indians through an article in Britain's Sunday Times. For several years, Survival was run exclusively by volunteers who, in addition to raising awareness and the profile of humanitarian issues relating to indigenous people, advocated at international level, especially at the United Nations. Since then, Survival has become a vast worldwide movement present in over 100 countries with campaigns to raise awareness and to mobilize. It is important to note that Survival does not accept government funding or funding from large corporations. There are numerous success stories in this NGO's history. For example, Survival has succeeded in creating the largest area of indigenously controlled rainforest in the world to help protect the indigenous Yanomami people on the Brazil-Venezuela border. It contributed to the victorious struggle of the Dongria Kond, who live in the state of Odisha in eastern India, against mining giant Vedanta, who would have wanted to extract bauxite from their hills at an estimated $2 billion worth, violating, however, the mountain of law, the Niam Dongar, and disrupting the course of rivers. Survival has enabled the Kalahari Bushmen to return to their land, a desert region between South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana. It is also worth remembering that the Convention on the Rights of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, adopted in 1989 by the International Labour Organization, is the only international legislative instrument for the protection of these communities, which Italy has not ratified like most European countries, because at present only 24 of the 187 members of the ILO have ratified the convention. And among these 24, 5 are European Union countries: Denmark, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Spain. Therefore, ratifying the convention means assuming the commitment to the protection of the physical and spiritual integrity of indigenous peoples and against all discrimination. This is a commitment to be made in every forum, at international institutions such as the World Bank, but also bilaterally, as well as with development cooperation projects and initiatives supported by the European Union. I would like to inform our guests that the bill for the ratification of the convention was presented by our colleague Lia Quartapelle. And also, in the light of what may emerge from today's hearing, I will do my best to ensure that the committee schedules the measure in due time. As for the specifics of Brazilian legislation, under the 1988 Federal Constitution of Brazil, it is the responsibility of the government to demarcate and the territories inhabited by indigenous peoples. The Brazilian Constitution provides safeguards that characterize these areas as lands for the exclusive and permanent use of indigenous peoples, inalienable and unavailable for purposes other than the protection of the life projects of these people. Well, after more than 30 years of the Constitution, according to data from the Indigenous Missionary Council, there are still 821 indigenous lands with some administrative disputes that prevent their regularization. Not only that, but the Supreme Federal Court of Brazil resumed on August 25th the process that will decide whether the demarcation of Brazilian indigenous lands will be subject to the criterion of the so-called time mark, supported by the agro-industrial sector and the Bolsonaro government. According to this parameter, any requests for demarcation of lands can be made only if the indigenous people can prove that they have been on that territory since before the 1988 Constitution. They have to demonstrate it. In other words, if this thesis is approved, indigenous peoples who wish to make a request for demarcation of lands will have to prove that they were already on that territory at the time of the promulgation of the 1988 Constitution, or that they had an open dispute in progress. The issue of the time framework is also contained in a bill under consideration by the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies, which stipulates that contact with tribes must be avoided unless it constitutes state action of public benefit, but without specifying its scope, thus leaving a wide margin for interpretation that encourages the occupation of areas inhabited by indigenous peoples by illegal activities. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has already expressed his views on this controversy, urging the Brazilian Supreme Court to guarantee the rights of indigenous communities on their lands, stressing that, and I quote, "These rights do not derive from a concession by the state, but from the very fact that they are the original inhabitants of these lands and have lived on these lands long before Europeans arrived in Brazil." I wish to remind our guests that the Committee on Human Rights, then chaired by our colleague Yolanda Di Stasio, has already addressed these issues with the hearing of a delegation of representatives of the peoples of the Amazon held on October 17th, 2019. On that occasion already, also thanks to the touching and direct testimony of the exponents of indigenous communities, unanimous sharing of their legitimate demands for the promotion of an integral development and ecology had emerged. I will add that short video testimonies will be shown during the hearing, and I now give the floor to our guests, Ms. Francesca Casella, Director of Survival International Italy, who is connected remotely. Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chairperson, and all the honorable members of the Standing Committee on Human Rights in the world for giving us the time and space to denounce a situation of human rights violations of great national and international importance that concerns Brazil. Thank you also for your words with regards to our NGO. As you said, we are here to prevent the genocide of indigenous people. We are here to prevent the extermination of these people. And I will go straight to the point and to the heart of this issue. I will give you some numbers, some data. According to the latest census conducted in 2010 in Brazil, nearly 900,000 indigenous people lived, divided into at least 305 distinct peoples. Researchers believe that today this number exceeds 1 million. There are around 700 indigenous territories at different stages of recognition. Of these, 487 have been fully and officially demarcated, while others are still waiting for the end of the process or some kind of government intervention, despite, as you recalled, the fact that the Constitution obliged the government to complete all recognition by 1993. Many of these territories do not enjoy any form of protection. Brazil is also home to the largest concentration of uncontacted peoples in the world. According to FUNAI, the government agency for indigenous affairs, there may be as many as 114 uncontacted tribes and groups, although many of them have not yet been formally identified. Little is known about uncontacted peoples, except that their isolation is always the result of a forced choice made to survive invasions. Many of them are in fact survivors, or they are descendants of survivals of atrocities committed in previous areas, for example, during the rubber boom in the Western Amazon. Gruesome violence that forced them to take refuge in increasingly remote areas of their territories to escape the massacres and lethal diseases introduced by their invaders. Sometimes these peoples have or have had sporadic relations with the nearest indigenous people, but whatever their personal history, in most cases, their flight continues to this day in the knowledge that contact with the outside world is still the greatest threat to their existence. Maneuver after maneuver, since his inauguration, President Jair Bolsonaro has made every possible attempt to assimilate these tribes and open their lands to exploitation. And as for all the other indigenous peoples of Brazil, this is surely one of the worst moments in their recent history since the military dictatorship. Talking about the genocidal policy of Bolsonaro, who even before his inauguration had literally declared war on all indigenous people of the country, is almost superfluous now, because it is in the public domain. Indigenous organizations rightly define it as a legalized genocide. However, I would like to remind this committee that his government is relentlessly encouraging the theft and destruction of indigenous territories, their illegal invasion, violent attacks on communities, and the killing of indigenous people. It is urging the forcible contact and integration of uncontacted peoples, exposing them to the risk of extermination. It is supporting the lethal proposal of the time framework, which establishes that indigenous peoples who on October 5th, 1988, the day the Brazilian Constitution was promulgated, did not physically inhabit their lands, and no longer have any right to live there. If passed, this would have a devastating impact on dozens of uncontacted peoples and territories, hundreds of indigenous territories. Furthermore, by cutting funding and firing inconvenient officials, it is stifling and paralyzing crucial government bodies such as FUNAI, Department of Indigenous Affairs, and the Environment Agency, IBAMA, that are responsible by law for defending the lives and lands of indigenous peoples. His government is advocating for Bill 490, also known as the Death Bill, which brings together a series of bills and constitutional amendments that once again aim to deprive the indigenous peoples of their land for the benefit of agribusiness and to allow forced contact with uncontacted peoples. Also part of this blockade is the infamous mining bill, which would open up indigenous territories to large-scale mining. Recently, I'm sure you have heard that illegal extraction of gold in this area arrives in our stores, in our markets, after it has been clean of indigenous people's blood. And lastly, it is planning to open the lands of uncontacted tribes to exploitation that would, for them, be lethal by canceling the territorial protection ordinances that protect their very territories. And it is precisely these ordinances that I would like to draw your attention to today. And I will do so by showing a few short videos, testimonies of two peoples with the territorial protection ordinances in place. So I would ask technicians to project the videos.
Gente que quer curar, que muito lugar, que daqui café tudinho, né? Que matou tudinho, minha tia, não, é minha tia não, é minha sogra que matou, minha sogra que matar, 9 filhas, vambora, matou, vambora lá, uturaram, para, aí vem pra cá, né? Aí tira, já tá lá em cima, né? Pega, aí fiquei para canoa, aí que vambora, aí manda um lugar, né? Manda um lugar, manhã tem couro, muito de pinho, evento de rio, que vai embora pra cá, aqui ó, pedi procura pra cá, branca com checo, aí eu cortar, né? Aqui ó, minha avó, aí parou não. E parou para mim, não, chora não. A branca com que cortou, eu falei. Aí eu falei, aí meu pai falou, não é branca aqui, não é o macaco, não é macaco, rapaz, é porque é branco, tá? E tu tem que derrubar muito de manteiga. Aí eu falei a caça lá nem tem, né? Aí minha mãe fica lá, eu, tudo aqui, ó. Tudo aqui, ó. Andando. Tá minha irmã. Tô eu, minha irmã, meu pai, minha mãe, meu irmão. E eu, tô. Aí tu tá aqui procurando aqui andar. Meu irmão, esse aí. Meu irmão, a outra aqui tamanduá aqui minha tumbília. Tem doida. Agora que eu vi da tapiri, eu tô pensando aqui em matar, que tem muita gente aqui andando, tá? Que mais matar é de doida, matar aí, ó, não tem mais.
There is a second video. However, I could not hear the audio of the video. I don't know if this is an issue that I am having on my end. Can you hear me? We can hear you here from Rome, yes. I don't know if our other guests could hear you or the audio.
Blanket of dense rainfall.
Yes, I can hear the audio fine.
Most violent regions in Brazil. Armed loggers and powerful ranchers are illegally razing the trees to the ground. Here live the uncontacted Coahiva Indians. They hunt, fish, and gather fruits and honey, living on the run to escape violence from outsiders. Attacks and disease have killed their relatives. These are the last of the Coahiva, one of the most vulnerable peoples on the planet. If their land is not protected, they will disappear forever. But if Brazil's government acts fast, they can survive. We are the global movement for tribal people's rights, and we're doing everything we can to secure the Coahiva's land for them. Help us make Brazil take action. Join the movement.
Grazie.
Thank you. I will go into more detail regarding Rita's situation and her people's, the Piripura. We heard her testimony. She has recently left isolation and is very worried about her her relatives and her territory. If they are not protected, they will not survive. I was saying that territorial protection ordinances are emergency measures which were introduced in 1996 to protect the territories of uncontacted peoples for whom the long process of official demarcation had not yet been undertaken or concluded. This will make it illegal for timber smugglers, miners, and other invaders to access tribal lands. Without this form of protection, forests would be completely destroyed, and the people who protect them and depend on them for survival could be wiped out completely. Over time, these ordinances have saved some tribes or their last members from certain death. Today, these ordinances protect 7 territories inhabited by uncontacted peoples and over 1 million hectares of Amazon rainforest. They must be renewed periodically every 2 or 3 years after verifying that their original inhabitants are still there. In recent months, the existing ordinances on some of these territories have expired, but instead of renewing them, the Brazilian government, with the help of high-ranking officials from FUNAI, secretly plotted to cancel them. The mobilization was by the international community was enormous. Together, COIAB, OPI, APIB, and ISA, and us at Survival International have launched a campaign called Uncontacted or Destroyed to force the Brazilian government to renew them as it should by law. As a result of our lobbying, 3 of the ordinances were recently renewed, but only for 6 months, which is simply not enough time to remove all the invaders or to complete the procedures for a full demarcation of these territories. A 4th is now expired since December and requires urgent action by authorities. The areas which have expired are the Jacareuba Catawixi Indigenous Territory in the Amazon state expired on December 8th, 2021. The Piripura Indigenous Territory which will expire on March 18th, 2022. The Pirititi Indigenous Territory in the state of Roraima, which expires on June 6th, and the Ituna Itata Indigenous Territory in the state of Para, which will expire on July 1st, 2022. FUNAI offices has been officing for months now the request for an issuance of a new protection order in an area where a specialized FUNAI team verified the existence of an uncontacted tribe. And this occurred last September near the Purus River in the southern part of the state of the Amazon. A few dozen people, probably belonging to the Arawak people, were identified, and the team sent a report to Brasilia and has already written 3 times to the FUNAI leadership asking for the protection of the territory because of the extremely high risk of contact between the tribe and the gatherers of forest products active in the area. Among the gatherers, there is a high incidence of malaria and COVID, which could be lethal to the uncontacted. Nevertheless, those solicitations have not yet been answered, and the Federation of Indigenous Communities and Peoples of the Middle Purus have exposed that this tribe is at certain risk of genocide. I would ask you to project the 3rd video that I have prepared. Thank you. In this video, we speak of conspiracies, and that is literally what we mean. Let me just give you one example of the cover-up strategies uncovered and denounced by indigenous organizations by telling you about Ituna Itata, which means smell of fire, one of the territories protected by the ordinances, territorial ordinances that expired on January 25th, which, as you will see later in other images, was also the indigenous territory that in 2019 suffered the highest rate of deforestation in the country, according to sources from organizations COIAB and OPI. 84% of the deforestation of this territory has occurred in the last 3 years, or since President Bolsonaro took office. According to the National Institute of Space Research, INPE, during the Bolsonaro government, deforestation in the lands where uncontacted peoples live has increased by 1,493%. We went from around 580 hectares on average in the decade 2009-2018 to 9.2 million hectares from 2019 onwards. And I have some images to show you exactly what I mean.
Ecco, avete visto nelle foto l'aumento vertiginoso del
As you can see in these images, this increase in deforestation, starting with areas of the Piripura territories, and in the last slide, the territories of Ituna Itaka, which I just mentioned briefly. To renew the ordinances, FUNAI must prove the tribe's continued existence in the affected areas. So in August, some of the officials traveled to the area where they found clear evidence of their existence, including food remains, a bowl, and areas cleared by humans. They compiled a detailed report on the matter that was covered up to deny human presence in the area. And shown to Senator Zequinha Marinho during his secret meeting with FUNAI's top leadership. Senator Marinho is a great supporter of President Bolsonaro and is strongly linked to the mining and agro-industrial lobby, as well as to the extremist groups of the evangelical church. In 2020, OP had already denounced the senator's attempts to drastically reduce the area of Ituna Itata, and the fact that this evidence was reported and that he was unable to read, in the report the exact location of the evidence found is a serious fact that he has to put the tribes of the area in enormous danger. In the past, it has happened that similar information, confidential information, has been used by timber traffickers and agricultural entrepreneurs to attack and kill uncontacted peoples. This was a strategic event because many were away for the holidays, because this happened on December 29th. FUNAI also ratified an internal decision that prohibits territorial protection activities in indigenous lands whose demarcation processes have not yet been completed. This is an unconstitutional measure that has left hundreds of territories unprotected, mostly the most vulnerable lands, most encroached upon and most dangerous for their indigenous inhabitants. The measure also affects undemarcated land of uncontacted peoples protected by the ordinances. So it is difficult to imagine a greater betrayal of FUNAI's mission, an official body that exists to defend the rights of indigenous peoples, but that is now actively working to exterminate them. Fortunately, thanks to the pressure exerted by the indigenous organizations represented by the APIB, the case reached the Supreme Court just a few days ago, February 2nd, and the judge spoke out against the maneuver of FUNAI, accused of contravening its first responsibilities, and annulled it. Pressure exerted at the national and international level have led a federal judge to order the renewal of the ordinance on Ituna Itata, which I said took place recently on February 1st, even if only for a few months, 6 months. I would like to end by reminding you that uncontacted people are the symbol of diversity, of human diversity. They are an unalienable part of humanity, as the chairperson said, and they are the protectors of their environment. Their lands are targeted because they are so well preserved and so rich in resources. However, uncontacted people are also the most vulnerable groups and tribes, both due to the violences that they incur, but also because of diseases that are brought inside their areas and their lands by invaders. Contact with the outside, like was mentioned earlier, can lead to death, and it can lead to the death of entire tribes and groups. And this has happened. Uncontacted people are also human societies that have the least possibilities of protecting their rights and having their voice heard. Human rights, fundamental human rights, recognized to all human beings, but all specific rights that indigenous people have, recognized by the Brazilian government, by the ILO 196 of convention. These are all rights that de facto the Bolsonaro government is not respecting and is trying to suppress. So we are working staunchly to prevent any anti-indigenous project by Bolsonaro. We are doing it, us here at Survival International, with other NGOs that we are working with at an international level. Bolsonaro is adopting criminal strategies and constitutional strategies that were stated publicly when he said that 1 centimeter of unindigenous land would not be demarcated under his government. And government officials have stated that hesitation by the government when we come to implementing these protections and ordinances, and statements by the presidents on the fact that these ordinances will not be renewed, promote illegal occupation and undiscriminated deforestation of areas and territories. So this situation is critical now, and with the approaching of presidential elections, it is highly likely that activities will increase in those areas. We are receiving a call from Brazil to prevent this genocide and asking the Bolsonaro government to uphold his responsibilities and his promises, also in terms of international and national community. So we appeal to this committee to ask what our government can do to help these indigenous peoples in Brazil, and also of uncontacted peoples through their relatives which have left isolation before it is too late. We have a testimony in the video where Rita told her story. This is a question of human rights. We know that we cannot make up for errors and exterminations of the past, but we can certainly try to prevent suffering in the future, because we can do something now and today. So I would like to thank this committee and the chairperson, Madam Boldrini, once again for focusing attention and raising awareness on this topic. And I would like to end with one last video, not of an uncontacted tribe, but by the leader of the guardians of the forest. And he will tell us how his group and his tribe are losing their lives to protect their land, their territories, and our nature. So I would ask the technicians to project the last video. Thank you.
Meu nome é Olímpio Santos Silveira Muguajajara, coordenador-geral dos Guardiões da Terra Indígena Lariboia. O guardião é aquele que está defendendo os direitos do seu povo e está defendendo os isolados, né? E está defendendo o bioma da natureza para todos nós que foram assassinados 3 guardiões dentro da nossa terra, né? Nenhum desses assassinos estão de trás das grades. O meu povo está sofrendo. A terra está clamando pelo público internacional que seja uma conservação permanente no nosso mundo, no nosso país, em qualquer país do mundo, né? Eu quero que as pessoas se sensibilizem muito mais. Eu quero que o público internacional se sensibilize em defender a vida e o pulmões do mundo junto com a gente.
Grazie, dottoressa Casella. Thank you, Ms. Casella, for this detailed report, and which has also answered many of our questions or queries that we were asking ourselves during our presentation. So I would now leave the floor to Lia Quartapelle, who is connected remotely and asked for the floor. Thank you. I would also like to thank Survival International, Francesca Casella, for her report and for this hearing, because this is a very important topic. And during this government, we still haven't addressed it specifically, but we realize how important the environmental issue is strongly linked to the population. So I would just briefly like to add that I will support any measure that the chairperson will decide to undertake, or any contact with the Brazilian embassy to refer any of the topics that we've heard today, because they are very interesting for our committee in general, for the Foreign Affairs Committee. Initiatives of the Bolsonaro government go against initiatives of the Brazilian government and are threatening uncontacted peoples and in general the entire ecosystem of the Amazon forest. We've already spoken about this with the ambassador during his hearing, but I think that we need to reiterate all these worrying points that were just expressed by Ms. Casella and Survival International. Thank you. Thank you, Giulia Quartapelle. I will now leave the floor to Yolanda Di Stasio, who chaired this committee before the new government. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I would just like to thank you first and foremost for organizing this hearing. We have already addressed these issues because the environmental aspect is so interlinked with human rights, not only at supranational level, but also international level. So thank you, and thank you to our guests today. Everything that I've heard, I absolutely agree with and confirm our worries regarding the risk of deforestation, high risk of deforestation. I was reading just recently of a recent inquiry regarding deforestation, which could refer to around 400 kilometers of square kilometers of deforestation, so a huge territory, and that is disrupting the supply chain, trying to gain control of areas that can be used for agriculture or so on, or other purposes. And also, there's also an increase by fashion industries and greenwashing that would report that around 20 fashion industries could be responsible in part of land deforestation. And we're talking about big names they could be in part responsible for deforestation and the destruction of these lands. So I'm also in support of any initiatives that can help indigenous peoples, as we've already mentioned. But also, I would like to reaffirm my point of view, and that is that we need to raise awareness not only at national and international level, but also supernatural, European level, international level, of course, because there are a series of responsibilities in that areas that need to be accounted for. So I reiterate my full support to Chairperson Boldrini, and also support for indigenous peoples that have today brought their testimonies. Hopefully this will increase awareness and mobilization, and I thank you for what you're doing in that area. Thank you, Ms. Di Stasio. I would leave the floor to Mr. Olgiati. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank our guests because that was a very interesting testimony. I participated in 2019 in a hearing with representatives of indigenous tribes and was touched by those testimonies. And it has a certain effect, hearing that after 2 or 3 years, very little has changed. Maybe things have even worsened. What I would like to add is that we need to be aware of the situation, understand fully what is happening, because unfortunately we have no power in Brazil, of course. Deployment and destruction of natural lands and of human rights overall, I think over the past years has worsened with the Bolsonaro government. The upcoming presidential elections, of course, I don't think will help because, of course, economic interests go far beyond the interest of smaller groups. I'm not familiar with the numbers, but of course, economic interests are stronger, unfortunately. I believe that, and I don't know if I can say this, I hope that the elections in Brazil will represent a change in step of the Brazilian government, whatever the new government elected will be. I hope this will be a key for international mobilization and awareness because it goes through solidarity, and it is our duty to continue supporting and raising awareness for these groups and these peoples. But I think that, of course, Brazil needs to take proactive action and to change things. So again, I confirm my full support for any measure or initiative that will be taken by our committee, and I hope that as far as what we can do, the approval of the convention that was mentioned earlier is a first step that we need to accelerate. And of course, we give our full availability to support any initiative and measure to protect these peoples and protect this genocide, as it were. Thank you. Thank you. If there are no other remarks, I would like to add a few words, and would start by thanking Ms. Casella and Ms. Watson, who is following us remotely. I would like to thank them for their efforts, for the passion, and I believe that protecting these peoples is an ethical duty, because we're talking about an issue that is of universal interest. So this is a shared responsibility, shared commitment. This is not only responsibility of Brazil, which of course in large part is on their end, but it goes well beyond that, because we want to protect these peoples, these groups, these tribes, and we also want to protect nature and the territories of the Amazon, because it is vital for the ecological balance of our planet. So in light of what we have heard today, I think that I can say that our committee needs to take on commitments. We said we would add the ratification proposal of Lia Quarta Pelle to our agenda. So we will do our very best to make sure that this will happen, so that Italy can ratify this convention together with European countries that have already done so. And I'm asking myself, maybe Ms. Casella has an answer, why are there only 24 countries that have ratified the ILO convention? It appears absurd that the number is so limited. Why only 24? And the other point is trying to hear the Brazilian ambassador to understand in more depth all of the issues that have come up today, and highlight what has come up from today's hearing and with the hearing of Survival International, to express our worries directly to the ambassador of Brazil. I also think we need to act at international level and solicit and urge and I am not aware of any parliamentary document when it dates back to, but I believe we need to urge interest and awareness on this point, because like I said, it is a shared commitment. So that is what I wanted to add. I will leave the floor to Ms. Casella for any remarks. Thank you. And I thank you for your remarks. Thank you to Ms. Quarta Pelle for the promotion of ILO 196 proposal. That is a huge satisfaction for me, because we have been trying to do so for years. And so this is something that we are very happy about and very proud of. And maybe this will answer your question, Madam Chairperson. The ILO Convention, as opposed to other conventions on the indigenous peoples, is the only tool that is legally binding for any government once it is ratified. So it binds the government to respect and forces the government to respect those that convention. So it is more inconvenient for governments to do so and to ratify it, of course. I believe that we must do so as soon as possible, because we've heard that this will help our country to guarantee due diligence and the respect of the rights of indigenous peoples on the basis of this convention. I also believe that public pressure that can be exerted, and obviously political pressure at both the national, Italian, and European level is fundamental. And in this regard, I would like to mention something that occurred just recently, and that is that France publicly announced that it will reject the presentation of Brazil's accession to OECD unless it adheres to the convention and its principles. That is a very strong message, a very concrete action that we hope can increase awareness and open up further debate on these issues. So I would just like to reiterate that we are fully available if you need any support, data, or technical knowledge for any initiative that you would like to bring forward. So thank you again. Thank you. And you've just given us another idea, because I think that we could call for a resolution on based on what France has done, because we could possibly join forces with France and push for Brazil's accession to OECD. So I think that could be some type of pressure that we could enforce. So thank you once again. And I would like to thank the interpreters for their help, and I officially declare this hearing closed.